Hey everyone, and welcome. We're diving into one of the biggest debates in psychology, holism versus reductionism. Now, if you're studying for your A-levels, you absolutely need to get your head around this because it pops up in so many different topics you'll be covering.
So, what's this all about, really? Well, at its heart, the debate asks a pretty fundamental question. When we're trying to figure out something as messy and complicated as human behavior, do we get the best answer by looking at the whole person in their world, the big picture? Or is the secret to it all found by breaking everything down into its simplest, smallest parts, the tiny details?
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to define the two sides, making sure you've got that core AO1 knowledge totally locked down. Then we'll see how these ideas actually apply to real psychological topics. That's going to be your AO2. After that, we'll dive into some critical evaluation, using the GRAVE framework to help you build those top-tier AO3 arguments. And finally, we'll see how it all comes together in a really satisfying way.
Right, let's get those core definitions sorted. This is your absolute foundation for any essay question on this topic. This is your essential AO1 knowledge.
Okay, first up, holism. This approach basically says you can't understand a person by just studying their individual parts in isolation. Think of humanistic psychologists like Maslow and Rogers. They were all about the whole person's experience. Or Gestalt psychology with that famous saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For a holist, context is king. You just lose the meaning if you only look at the little pieces.
And on the complete other side of the ring, we have reductionism. This is the more, let's say, traditional scientific approach of breaking down complex behavior into smaller, much more manageable chunks. The idea is that by understanding the simplest parts, we can then build up our understanding of the whole thing. It's kind of like trying to figure out how a car works by taking the engine apart piece by piece. Reductionism often works on what we call levels of explanation. I want you to imagine you're zooming in on a behavior with a camera. So from way out, the most holistic level, you're seeing all the social and cultural factors. Zoom in a little closer, and you start to see the psychological stuff, like someone's thoughts and feelings. Then, zoom in as far as you can possibly go, and you're at the most reductionist level, pure biology, things like genes and neurotransmitters.
Now, for your A-level, there are two key types of reductionism you really need to know, and it all comes down to what you're reducing the behavior to. Is it our internal biology, or is it our external environment?
So first, you've got biological reductionism. This is the absolute bread and butter of the biological approach. It boils behavior right down to our internal workings. A classic example is explaining schizophrenia as just having too much dopamine. Then the other type is environmental reductionism, which is the language of the behaviorists. It reduces everything to simple external stimulus-response links. So explaining a phobia as a learned association between, say, a spider and the feeling of fear. Simple as that.
Okay, now for the fun chord. Let's see how you can actually apply these concepts to topics you've already studied. This is where you really start picking up those super important AO2 marks. By showing the examiner, you can use these ideas, not just spit out definitions.
Let's take depression as an example. A reductionist biological view might say it's caused by low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin. So, the logical treatment? An SSRI drug to fix that chemical imbalance. Simple. But a holistic view would step back and say, hang on. We also need to consider things like negative thought patterns, major life events, or even family relationships. And that kind of thinking leads to therapies like CBT. What's really key here is that the most effective treatments today often combine both, and that tells you a lot about where this whole debate ends up.
Schizophrenia is another fantastic example. Biological reductionism has given us drug therapies that target dopamine, and they are often really effective at reducing symptoms. But it's become super clear that biology just isn't the whole story. And a really fascinating study from Finland helps explain exactly why.
This brings us to a key piece of evidence, the TNRE study. What they did was they tracked Finnish adoptees who had a known genetic risk for schizophrenia. And the really crucial finding was that this genetic vulnerability was way more likely to actually be triggered if the child grew up in a stressful or dysfunctional family environment.
And this just brilliantly illustrates why we need an interactionist approach. The study itself has high validity. It's a well-controlled long-term adoption study. But its main takeaway, the big message, is that you can't just look at genes and you can't just look at the environment. You have to look at how the two interact.
Okay, let's switch gears to social psychology. Milgram's classic 1963 obedience study. It's a really powerful argument for a more holistic view. What's so fascinating is that he couldn't find a single obedient personality type. Instead, his work showed very powerfully that the situation itself, the authority of the experimenter, the formal lab coat, the university setting, had this incredible power to make ordinary people do extraordinary things.
So, when we're evaluating Milgram, we can see its huge applicability, right? It helps us understand huge historical events like the Holocaust. But we also have to be critical. The generalizability of his findings is often questioned because his original sample was entirely American men, and that might not represent how other cultures or women would behave in the same situation. Okay, it's time to build your evaluation. To get those top marks in an essay, you have to be able to weigh up the pros and cons of each approach. This is your AO3 toolkit.
Let's kick off with reductionism. On the plus side, it's the language of science. By isolating variables, you can run controlled experiments, and that gives psychology way more scientific credibility. And this has led to some incredibly useful practical applications, like drug therapies. But what's the major downside? Well, it can seriously oversimplify complex behaviors, ignoring all the important context. And the risk is that you end up with treatments that just mask symptoms, kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a deep wound, instead of tackling the real root cause.
Now let's flip it and look at holism. Its main strength is obvious. It gives a much more complete and realistic understanding of human behavior. It acknowledges that we're complex people living in a complex social world. But this is also its biggest weakness. Holistic concepts can be pretty vague and really hard to test scientifically. I mean, how exactly do you measure self-actualization in a lab? And this can make it tricky to develop targeted, practical treatment.
So, where does that leave us? Are we just forced to pick a side? Well, no, not at all. Actually, the most sophisticated answer is to combine the two perspectives, and that is what we call the interactionist approach.
The interactionist approach sees these different levels of explanation as partners, not rivals. It really is the best of both worlds. It's perfectly captured in the diathesis stress model, which we just saw with schizophrenia. You have a biological vulnerability, the diathesis, and that's combined with an environmental trigger, the stress. It's the same story with depression, where the most effective treatment is often a combination of SSRIs, which is a reductionist approach, and CBT, which is a more holistic one.
So if there's one thing you take away for your essays, let it be this. The highest level thinking always integrates insights from different levels. By combining the biological with the psychological and the social, you build a much more powerful and complete understanding of human behavior than either approach could ever give you on its own.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought to take into your revision. In a subject as fascinatingly complex as psychology, can an explanation that is purely reductionist or purely holistic ever really be enough? Thanks for tuning in.